The grand dining room of Harrison Manor was empty, save for Robert Harrison, who sat alone at the table meant for 20. The room was filled with opulence, crystal chandeliers that glittered like 1,000 stars, fine china polished to perfection, and gilded frames holding portraits of ancestors who had once walked with pride in the world outside. But in this space, Robert felt more trapped than he ever had in his life. The marble floors gleamed with a coldness that mirrored his own heart. At 52, Robert had everything wealth could buy, except for the one thing that mattered most, the ability to walk. It had been 20 years since the accident, 20 years since the car had veered off the road, taking away his legs, and with them, the life he had once known. The world he inhabited now was a gilded cage, beautiful and expansive, but suffocating all the same. His fortune, the $40 million he had accumulated over decades of hard work, meant nothing when he was trapped in a body that no longer obeyed his commands. He could buy all the comfort in the world, but none of it could heal the deepest wound, the loss of mobility, the loss of self. Every morning, as the housekeeper prepared his breakfast, Robert would stare at his legs, willing them to move. They never did. The mansion had become a prison. His wife had left 15 years ago, unable to endure the bitterness that had taken root in him after the accident. His friends had drifted away one by one, tired of his dark moods and endless complaints. Even his mother, Elena, now 78, visited less and less. She had stopped trying to fix him, understanding that some wounds could never heal. He hadn't had a meaningful conversation with anyone in years. Tonight, as snow gently fell outside the grand windows, Robert sat at the dining table, his untouched meal in front of him. He had no appetite. The world beyond the glass seemed far away, a world he could only watch from his chair, a world of walking people. He wondered, not for the first time, if they ever thought about how lucky they were to be able to walk, to run, to simply stand. His gaze lingered on the snowfall, his thoughts wandering, when a soft knock at the servants' door interrupted the stillness. He frowned. Who could possibly be visiting at this hour? The housekeeper had left hours ago, and Robert wasn't expecting anyone. The knocking continued, gentle but insistent, like a reminder that someone was out there. Curiosity stirred within him, something he hadn't felt in years. He wheeled himself slowly down the hallway, past the family portraits of ancestors who had all walked freely, past the rooms filled with furniture arranged for someone who would never stand again. The knocking had stopped, but Robert opened the heavy door anyway. There, standing on the doorstep, was the smallest person he'd ever seen, a little girl, no older than 6, shivering from the cold. Her clothes were ragged, her shoes torn and too small for her feet. The jacket she wore was thin, barely enough to protect her from the biting winter air. She stood there, eyes wide with a mixture of hunger and innocence. "Mister," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm really hungry. Do you have any food you're not going to eat?" Robert stared at her in shock. In all the years of his isolation, no one had ever come to him for something so simple, so unpretentious. People had come for his money, his influence, but never for the basic human need of food, and certainly no one had ever asked him with the pure, unguarded eyes of this little girl. "What are you doing out here alone?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse, barely above a rasp. "I live with my mama in the apartment over there," she said, pointing to a rundown building across the street. "She's working late again, and I got hungry." Mrs. Patterson next door said, "Rich people throw away good food all the time." The words came out in a quick rush, as though they were rehearsed, learned from the adults who had spoken to her in passing. Robert's eyes flicked to the little girls, noticing something different about them. They were the brightest blue he had ever seen, and usually bright for a child, and full of a quiet determination. There was no fear in her gaze, no judgment. About his wheelchair, she looked at him as though he were just another person, another figure in a world she had yet to fully understand. "What's your name?" Robert found himself asking, more out of curiosity than anything else. His voice softened, the edges of his harshness worn down by the sheer simplicity of the moment. "Lily Thompson," the girl replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "What's yours?" "Robert Harrison, but you can call me Bob," he said, his tone uncharacteristically warm. Lily smiled, and for the first time in years, Robert felt something stir deep within him. It was a feeling so foreign, so long buried, that he almost couldn't name it. Hope, compassion, maybe even the faintest flicker of connection. The weight of his loneliness, which had grown so heavy over the years, seemed a little lighter in her presence. "I can make you a deal, Mr. Bob," Lily said suddenly, stepping closer. "You give me some of that food you didn't eat, and I'll give you something even better." Robert blinked in surprise, unable to hold back a dry laugh. "What could you possibly give me, little one?" Lily's small hand reached out, touching the armrest of his wheelchair with a gentle yet purposeful motion. "I can make you walk again," she said, her voice filled with such utter certainty that it caught Robert off guard. For a moment, a cold laugh bubbled in his throat, bitter and dark. "You think you can make me walk?" he asked, incredulous. "I know all the doctors, the therapists, the specialists. I've heard every miracle cure there is." Lily didn't flinch at his words. She simply looked at him, those wide blue eyes unwavering. "I know I can," she said, her tone as simple as a truth anyone should believe. "I've done it before." Robert didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, his cynicism faltered. The girl, with her ragged clothes and hungry stomach, spoke with the kind of quiet confidence he hadn't felt since before the accident. And in that moment, as the snow fell silently outside, something inside Robert Harrison began to stir, something he thought had long since died. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a reason to believe again. The morning after their brief exchange, Robert Harrison couldn't shake the little girl's words from his mind. As the housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, prepared his usual breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, both untouched, every morning he found himself staring at the empty chair across from him, wondering why he had even allowed himself to engage with her. Her words, "I can make you walk again," still echoed in his mind, a ridiculous promise, a child's fantasy. He had heard it all before, from well-meaning doctors, from faith healers, from con artists selling dreams. Yet, there was something in her tone that he couldn't dismiss. It wasn't just the childish hope, the untainted belief that the impossible was within reach. It was the absolute certainty in her eyes, as though she had done it before, as though she knew the secret to a cure no one else could see. He had no time for fantasies. He had no patience for the naive belief that kindness could undo what had been done to him. But somehow, even as he wheeled himself to the study, a faint, gnawing curiosity stirred inside him, and he found himself wondering, could it be true? Lily hadn't been back yet. He didn't expect her to return. She was just a child, after all. What did she know of the world's cruelties, of the deep ache in his legs that had stolen his life? The more he thought about it, the more he realized how bitter he had become, how isolated. He was a billionaire with everything at his fingertips. But nothing mattered when your body beges. Before he could sink deeper into his thoughts, there came a soft knock at the door. His heart skipped a beat before he could stop it. Mrs. Chen had left for the day, and no one else ever visited. Robert hesitated before wheeling himself toward the door, hoping for something different, anything that could break the monotony of his hollow existence. When he opened the door, there stood Lily again, her small frame even more striking in the daylight, the soft glow of the morning sun filtering through the frosted glass behind her. She stood there, smiling with an innocence that seemed so out of place in the world Robert inhabited. "Good morning, Mr. Bob," she said brightly, as if no time had passed. The sound of her voice, so free of any form of trepidation, disarmed him. Further, "I brought you something. Trade you. What was a mansion, a fortune, a title, when you couldn't even stand up to take a step?" Robert looked down at the crumpled paper bag she was holding, her small hands barely able to keep the corners from folding in. He expected a piece of candy, or perhaps another offering of gratitude for the food he had given her the night before. What he didn't expect was what she pulled out of the bag, a flower dot. It was small, delicate, and clearly picked from someone's garden. It was wilting slightly, the edges of its petals curling. But in Lily's hands, it was a treasure. She held it out to him as though it were the most precious thing she had. "I picked it for you," she said, the sincerity in her voice as bright as the morning sun. "Mama says when someone's nice to you, you should be nice back. This is for giving me dinner last night." Robert's hand shook as he took the flower from her, though he tried to hide it. His fingers hadn't held anything with such care in years. He wasn't used to gifts, especially not ones given without expectation. His life had been full of transactions, of people asking for favors, for money, for his influence. But this little girl, this ragged, hungry child, was offering him something with no strings attached, no expectations. Just kindness. The weight of her simple gesture crushed something deep inside him. "Thank you, Lily. That's very thoughtful," Robert said, his voice thick with something he couldn't quite place. Lily's smile widened, her eyes lighting up like she had just given him the moon. "Can I see your legs?" she asked. Suddenly, the question, so innocent, so simple, caught him off guard. For a moment, Robert's heart skipped. His legs. He had spent decades trying to forget them, trying to push them out of his mind. They were the source of all his pain, his loneliness, his bitterness. He had resigned himself to living with them as an afterthought, a reminder of all he had lost. But Lily, she didn't see them as something broken. She simply saw them as a part of him. "Why do you want to see them?" Robert asked, the question heavier than he intended. "Just because," she said. There was no hesitation in her voice, just a curiosity that made him want to trust her. "I think you'll be okay." He stared at her, unsure how to react. He had lived with the weight of his condition for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to simply be seen, not as a broken man, but as a person, a human. The bitterness that had taken root in him over the years had made him forget how to be anything other than a prisoner in his own body. But Lily, with her soft words and unshakable belief, was cracking that shell, just a little, slowly, almost hesitantly. He rolled up his pants. The movement felt strange, foreign, as if he were exposing some deep, personal wound to the world. His legs lay there, unmoving, as they always did. They were pale, thin, with the faintest traces of muscle that hadn't been used in decades. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Then, Lily placed her small hand on his leg. It was a gentle touch, but it sent a jolt through him, as though the warmth from her hand was reaching deeper than the surface. She didn't look at him with pity. She didn't flinch. She simply pressed her palm lightly against his leg, as if trying to connect with something that had been lost. "I know I can make you walk again," she whispered, her voice so sure, so steady. "You just have to believe it." Robert stared at her, his chest tightening. For the first time in 20 years, he felt something other than numbness, something that didn't come from bitterness or anger, a crack in his wall of indifference, a whisper of hope that he hadn't allowed himself to hear in all these years. He laughed then, but it was a hollow laugh, a laugh of disbelief. "You think you can make me walk?" His voice was shaky, more from the emotion swirling inside him than from the laughter itself. Lily didn't falter. "I know I can," she said softly, and for the first time in decades, Robert Harrison felt his heart stir. The days after Lily's visit were marked by an unusual stillness. Robert couldn't quite explain it, but something in him had shifted. He tried to push it away, tried to bury it under the mountain of cynicism and self-pity that had become his armor over the years. But no matter how hard he tried, Lily's words kept echoing in his mind. "I know I can make you walk again." The mornings bled into each other, just like they always did. The routine was the same. Mrs. Chen would prepare his breakfast, and he would stare at it, unable to bring himself to eat. The mansion, once his sanctuary, felt more like a tomb. The silence was deafening. He would roll his chair through the empty halls, past rooms filled with memories of a life he could never have again. He had lost the ability to move his legs, but it felt as if he had also lost his ability to move through life. The space around him, so vast and luxurious, seemed to shrink with each passing day, becoming nothing more than a gilded cage. It wasn't until the third morning that he realized what had been bothering him. The longing, the strange desire to feel something, anything, had finally broken through. He hadn't realized it before, but in Lily's simple, direct gaze, there had been more than just the kindness of a child. There had been something profound. Her certainty had planted a seed of tiny, fragile hope that had been growing quietly inside him, despite his best efforts to suppress it. And so, on the third day, Robert found himself in his study, staring at the door. Mrs. Chen had just left, and the house was as empty as it had always been. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He was expecting something, even though he didn't know what it was. Maybe it was Lily. Maybe it was the same absurd hope that had been gnawing at him. But he couldn't sit here any longer, doing nothing, letting the days pass him by. He needed to see her again, to hear her voice, to see if she could really make him believe. When the knock came at the door, it startled him. His heart skipped, and for a moment, he didn't know whether to open it or not. He knew what he was expecting. He had seen it in his dreams, in his nightmares. The tiny girl with the huge eyes and the even larger promise. But he had promised himself he wouldn't fall for it again. Not this time. Not after all the false hope he had clung to over the years. Still, he wheeled himself toward the door, his pulse quickening with each turn of the wheels. There was a faint whisper of snow on the wind outside, and he opened the door with a mixture of fear and expectation, and there she was, standing in front of him as if she had never left, that same innocent smile on her face. "Good morning, Mr. Bob," she said, her voice cheerful. Though it was clear the cold had left her a little shaken, she clutched a small bag in her hands, its edges frayed from use. Robert's eyes flicked down, and he noticed, for the first time, that she didn't seem as hungry as she had before. The wide-eyed innocence was still there, but there was something else in her posture now. Confidence, perhaps. He couldn't quite place it. "I brought you something," Lily said, reaching into the bag. This time, Robert didn't think she would offer a flower, but when she pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, his curiosity piqued. He raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "A map," she said, smiling. "I thought you might want to know where we're going." "Where we're going?" Robert repeated, his mind racing, his heart beat faster. "Where are we going, Lily?" "Wherever you want to go," she answered matter-of-factly. "I'm going to show you." And there it was again, the certainty. It wasn't just her words. It was the look in her eyes, the calmness in her voice. She wasn't asking for his belief. She was offering something much more powerful, a glimpse into the unknown, a chance to step beyond the walls of his despair. Robert's chest tightened, and before he could stop himself, he said, "You really think you can make me walk again, don't you?" Lily nodded, that same unwavering certainty in her expression. "I know I can. You just have to believe." He let the words settle between them, the weight of them heavy in the quiet room. The map she had handed him was simple, just a few lines scribbled in the corners. A place marked with a circle. Robert looked up at her, unsure of what to say. "And this place?" he asked, studying the map. "Where is this?" "It's not far," Lily said. "It's where the magic happens." Robert's heart thudded in his chest. "The magic?" "Yes," she said. "The place where everything changes." Her eyes sparkled with something that Robert couldn't quite identify. It was as if she had already been there, as if she already knew the answer to the question he had yet to ask. She wasn't just offering him hope. She was offering him a truth he hadn't considered in years, the possibility that his life, as hopeless and small as it felt, could be changed. But could he believe it after all this time, after everything he had been through? "I don't know, Lily," he said, his voice hoarse. "What if this is just another lie? What if nothing changes?" Lily's gaze softened. She took a step closer and placed her hand on his armrest, her small fingers curling around the edge as though anchoring him to the moment. "You won't know until you try, Mr. Bob." The simplicity of it hit him like a ton of bricks. "You won't know until you try." How long had it been since he had tried? How long had he been so certain that nothing could change, that he was trapped, not just in his wheelchair, but in his own mind? He looked at the little girl, standing before him with so much faith, and for the first time in a long time, something stirred inside him, something that felt like hope. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in the decades. "All right," Robert said, his voice quieter now. "Show me." Lily's smile widened. "I knew you would," as she led him outside into the cold morning air. Robert couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far bigger than he had ever imagined. This wasn't just about his legs or the promise of walking again. This was about something more profound, a chance to break free of the prison he had built for himself over the years. The snow crunched under his wheels, but for the first time in so long, Robert felt as if the ground was shifting beneath him. The air outside was colder than Robert had anticipated, the sharp bite of winter seeping into his skin. As Lily guided him through the winding paths of his mansion's garden, the snow had deepened overnight, covering everything in a fresh layer of white. For a moment, it almost seemed like they were walking through a dream, silent, untouched, and vast. Lily, unfazed by the cold, led the way with purpose. Robert, despite his skepticism, found himself following her through the crisp morning, each turn in the garden feeling like he was moving closer to something important. Though he couldn't yet understand what, she had been so confident, so certain. of her promise that Robert couldn't ignore it any longer. For the first time in years, he felt something other than the bitter resentment that had become his constant companion. His wheels cut through the fresh snow with a soft crunch, the sound of movement breaking the quiet that hung in the air like a thick fog. His thoughts were scattered, conflicted between disbelief and a small, quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, there was more to Lily's words than a child's fantasy. Could this little girl truly be offering him the one thing he craved more than anything in the world? Could she really make him walk again? Robert had heard it all before, from doctors, scientists, even the most well-meaning of strangers. They had promised him everything: experimental treatments, groundbreaking surgeries, miracle cures. He had spent thousands, hundreds of thousands, in search of the impossible, only to be left with more disappointment and more hopelessness than before. And yet, here he was, with Lily, a child with nothing but her simple belief and a worn-out piece of paper in her hand, leading him to what she called the place where everything changes. They reached the edge of the garden, where the path split, leading into the dense woods behind his mansion. It was a part of the property Robert hadn't explored in years, a place once filled with childhood memories of running and playing with his friends. Now, it seemed like a forgotten wilderness, wild and untamed. Lily stopped at the edge of the trees and turned to look at him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a calmness in her eyes that seemed to speak volumes. "This is it," she said, her voice steady. "The place where it begins." Robert's heart skipped. He was beginning to feel the weight of something heavy in the air of presence, a shift in the world around him. He didn't know if it was the landscape, the time of day, or the strange, palpable sense of possibility that was growing stronger with each passing moment. But something inside him felt different. He had been living in a shadow for so long, his body and mind locked in a constant battle of what was possible and what wasn't. But now, there was a stirring, a small but undeniable spark that refused to be extinguished. Lily motioned for him to follow her, and without thinking, Robert did. As they ventured further into the woods, the trees became denser, their bare branches twisting overhead like gnarled fingers reaching toward the sky. The path became uneven, the ground beneath them soft with the remnants of the snowfall and layers of wet leaves. Robert's chair jostled slightly, but Lily continued to lead him without hesitation, her small frame barely visible through the thickening trees. They walked in silence for a few moments, the quiet punctuated only by the sound of Robert's wheels crunching over the uneven ground. He couldn't help but feel like they were on the cusp of something important, something life-changing. He looked at Lily, who was still walking ahead, her expression calm and focused. There was no doubt in her eyes, no sign of hesitation. She believed, and, for reasons he couldn't explain, he was beginning to believe too. Soon, they reached a clearing. It was a small space, just large enough for a couple of people to stand in, surrounded by tall, ancient trees whose bark was rough and twisted. In the center of the clearing was a stone well, weathered by time and covered in moss. The sight of it stopped Robert in his tracks. Lily turned to face him, her gaze steady. "This is the place," she said again, her voice quieter now, almost reverential. "This is where it begins." Robert looked at the well, confusion swirling in his chest. "A well?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "You're telling me this is where I'll be healed? This is where I'll walk again?" Lily nodded, her gaze never wavering. "The well holds what you need, but you have to believe first. It only works if you believe." A strange chill ran down Robert's spine as he stared at the well. There was something about it that felt ancient, timeless, as if it had been waiting for him. He couldn't explain it, but a part of him, one that had been dormant for years, felt drawn to it, as though the well itself was calling him. Lily walked up to the well, her small hand resting lightly on the stone. She closed her eyes for a moment, her lips moving in a soft, quiet murmur, like she was saying something to herself. Robert watched her, his heart beating faster with each passing second. What was happening? Was this really the moment? Was he about to experience something that could change everything? After a moment, Lily opened her eyes and looked back at Robert. "You need to touch it, Mr. Bob," she said simply. Robert hesitated, his doubts swirling. He had tried everything, from therapy to surgeries, from experimental treatments to holistic remedies. All of them had promised him what this child was now offering him, and none had worked. Why should this be any different? His mind screamed. What makes this any different from all the other lies you've heard over the years? But there was something in Lily's eyes, something that pierced through his skepticism. He could see the purity of her belief, her absolute conviction that this would work. And for the first time, he found himself wondering what if this time it was real. With a deep breath, he wheeled himself closer to the well. His hands were cold, his heart racing. He reached out and placed his hand on the stone, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingertips. The moment he touched it, a strange sensation coursed through him. It wasn't physical, not exactly. It was more like a hum, a vibration that seemed to pulse through his entire being, filling him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. And then, it happened. A sharp, sudden pain shot through his legs, jolting him so hard that he gasped. It was as if every nerve in his body had come alive at once. His legs trembled, his muscles twitching as though they were waking from a long slumber. He looked down, his breath catching in his throat. His toes moved. For the first time in 20 years, Robert Harrison felt his toes move. He couldn't believe it. The sensation was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had come, but it was there. It had happened. His legs had moved. A sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, escaped his throat. He didn't care if it was real or a trick of his mind. He didn't care if it lasted for only a moment. What mattered was that for the first time into decades, he felt something he had thought was lost forever: hope. And in that moment, he knew that Lily had brought him to the place where everything changed. The truth had begun. The warmth in Robert's legs lingered, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't like the feeling of a sudden, full recovery. It wasn't as though he was standing or walking, but there was something far more profound, a spark, a flicker of life that he hadn't felt into decades. And with that flicker came a realization: the impossible might just be possible. But as quickly as the sensation came, it faded. His legs went numb again, the same numbness that had been his reality for 20 years. He looked down at them, his heart racing, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and wonder. Had he imagined it? Was it just his body playing tricks on him? The doubt crept in quickly, as it always did. He had been betrayed by his own body so many times before that he was reluctant to let himself believe anything could change. But he couldn't shake the memory of that brief, miraculous moment, the tiny spark of hope that had burned so brightly. Lily stood next to him, her small hand still resting on the stone well, as though she had known all along what was happening. Her expression was calm, but there was a quiet excitement in her eyes. She knew more than he did, more than he could understand in this moment. And he was beginning to wonder if that was the real miracle. This child, with her unwavering faith, her innocent certainty, had unlocked something inside him that no doctor, no treatment, no amount of money could ever reach. For the first time, Robert felt a pang of frustration. Why hadn't it worked? Why had it been so brief? He had spent so much of his life searching for a cure, for something to restore him to the life he had lost. He had thrown everything he had into that pursuit, but all of it had been hollow, empty promises. And now, here he was, standing at the edge of a moment that felt like it could change everything. Yet it had slipped away just as quickly. Did you feel it? Lily's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but insistent. Robert's eyes snapped to hers, the question hanging in the air between them. I don't know. I think I did. But then, he trailed off, unsure how to articulate what he had felt or what he had hoped to feel. Lily stepped closer, her small hand reaching out toward his legs again, her touch gentle but firm. She didn't say anything this time, but there was a quiet confidence in her movements, as though she knew what was about to happen. I know you felt it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You just have to trust it. Trust yourself. It's not just about what I can do for you, Mr. Bob. It's about what you're willing to believe. Her words were like a spark to dry tinder. He had spent so long in the dark, locked in his own bitterness, that he had forgotten what it was like to believe in something, anything. He had convinced himself that there were no miracles, no second chances. He had built his life around the idea that he was beyond saving, beyond hope. But Lily was showing him a different way that required him to trust, to believe that things could be different. Believe, she whispered again, and for the first time, he felt his body relax. The weight he had carried for so long, years of pain, frustration, and disappointment began to lift. Just a little. It wasn't gone. Not yet. But it was lighter. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the stillness of the moment to sink in. The world around him, the woods, the snow. Even the mansion beyond them, all of it faded into the background. It was just him and Lily, and in that space, a part of him wanted to believe, for once. He wanted to believe that this was possible. With a deep breath, he slowly moved his hand to the armrest of his wheelchair. His fingers brushed against the smooth surface, and he felt the familiar grip, the cold, unyielding metal that had been his constant companion for so long. But this time, something was different. He could feel the pressure of his hand more clearly, more acutely, as if his body was beginning to reconnect with itself in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Lily's eyes never left him. She was waiting. She was giving him the space to take the next step. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. For a moment, Robert wasn't sure if he was ready. He had spent so long in a prison of his own making, so long trapped in the belief that his body was beyond repair. But he knew that if he didn't try now, he never would. He had to trust. He had to trust her. And more importantly, he had to trust himself. With a slow, deliberate motion, Robert lifted his right hand from the armrest and placed it on the ground in front of him. His fingers trembled as they touched the earth, as if his body were remembering something it had long forgotten. His mind raced, 1,000 thoughts swirling around him. Was this really happening? Was he really going to try to stand? Could he even do it? Then, without thinking, without second-guessing, Robert pushed himself forward. The movement was slow, awkward. At first, his legs, still unresponsive, trembled with the effort. He felt a jolt of pain shoot through his body, but it wasn't the familiar, crushing pain of hopelessness. It was something different, something alive, something real. He pushed harder, his arms straining, his chest rising with effort. And then, as though by some miracle, his feet made contact with the ground. For the briefest of moments, Robert's legs supported his weight, and the world seemed to tilt, just a little, in his favor. But it wasn't enough. His body collapsed, and he sank back into the chair, breathless, overwhelmed. It had been too much, too fast. His legs shook with exhaustion, and he could feel the familiar numbness returning. But this time, it wasn't a defeat. It wasn't a surrender. This time, it was a beginning. Lily stepped forward, her eyes bright with something that wasn't just joy. It was the quiet certainty of a child who had seen a world of possibilities unfold before her. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her fingers warm and comforting. "You did it," she said simply. "You did it." Robert looked up at her, his chest rising and falling with the effort. His eyes met hers, and for the first time in 20 years, something in him cracked wide open. Not just his body, but his soul. His belief in himself had been reborn. He didn't know how much further he could go, how long it would take, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't giving up. Lily had shown him that. She had given him the gift of believing again. And for the first time into decades, Robert Harrison was ready to take the next step. The air felt different now, charged, almost electric, as Robert Harrison sat in his wheelchair, panting from the brief, yet intense, burst of effort. His legs were still trembling, his body aching in ways he hadn't felt in years. But something was shifting within him. He had moved. He had done it, even if it was only for a moment. The impossible had touched him. Lily stood quietly by his side, watching him with the kind of patience that only a child could possess. She hadn't said anything as he collapsed back into his chair, but her smile told him everything. She believed in him, and in that moment, Robert realized that, for the first time in his life, someone had believed in him more than he believed in himself. The thought was a revelation. The brief sensation of standing had awakened something deep inside Robert, a sensation so unfamiliar that it left him unsure how to proceed. The bitterness, the anger that had consumed him for so long, those dark emotions had retreated for a moment, and in their place was a quiet hope. Could this be real? Could he truly walk again? His mind raced, and yet, he couldn't quite answer the question. How could he? What if it was just his imagination? What if this was all some strange dream? A trick his mind was playing on him after years of torment. The world he knew, the world of impossibilities, seemed to be cracking around him, and Robert didn't know whether to embrace it or retreat into the cold safety of his doubts. Lily had stepped back, giving him space to breathe, space to process. She had been calm throughout, never rushing him, never pushing him further than he could handle. She simply waited like she knew he needed time to make sense of what was happening to him. "Do you want to try again?" Lily asked quietly, breaking the silence. Robert looked at her, her face glowing with quiet optimism. Her blue eyes filled with a certainty that made him want to believe in the impossible. His chest tightened. He wasn't sure he was ready. He wasn't sure he could handle the uncertainty that came with trying again. But Lily's simple question echoed in his mind. Do you want to try? And the truth was, for the first time in a long time, Robert did. He wanted to see if he could really do it. He nodded, slowly, unsure of how to move forward. Yes, he said, his voice a whisper. It felt like an impossible thing to say, like he was stepping off a cliff without knowing what waited below. But it was the truth. Lily's face lit up like the sun breaking through a storm. Good, she said, her voice full of warmth. She stepped closer, standing in front of him as if she were anchoring him in a sea of doubt. I'll help you. Robert gripped the wheels of his chair, his fingers cold against the metal. He glanced down at his legs again, almost afraid to see them, afraid of the disappointment that might come if they remained useless. But instead of dread, there was something else now, a strange, pulsing hope. Lily placed her small hand on his armrest again, her touch light, but firm. You can do this, Mr. Bob. You just have to trust. He exhaled slowly, then tightened his grip on the chair's arms. His heart raced as he began to push against the armrests, using every ounce of strength in his arms to lift himself forward. His legs, still trembling, felt heavy as though they were filled with lead. But there was something else now, a subtle warmth, an echo of the sensation he had felt earlier. The flicker of movement that told him he was not as broken as he once believed. The seconds stretched into minutes as Robert fought to move, to lift himself from the chair again. His legs refused to cooperate at first, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, he felt a change. His right leg twitched, a brief movement like the flutter of a bird's wings, and then it stopped. He tried again, this time with more force. His left leg followed suit, jerking slightly, then stilling. Lily's eyes never left him. She was watching, waiting. She didn't speak, but her gaze was full of encouragement. Robert closed his eyes, focusing all his energy on the task at hand. It was more than just physical effort now. It was mental, emotional. For so long, he had denied himself the possibility of recovery. He had convinced himself that he was beyond repair, that his life would always be confined to the chair. But now, as he felt the warmth begin to spread through his legs, he realized how deeply he had been lying to himself. He hadn't believed in anything for so long except that he was broken, except that he would never stand again. But now, the truth was different. The truth was unfolding before him in the form of a small girl with unwavering faith and a body that was starting to remember how to move. With a final push, Robert lifted himself fully out of the chair. His legs shook violently as they made contact with the ground. He couldn't stop them from trembling, but he was standing. His weight was on his legs, his body supported by the very thing that had failed him for years. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't a perfect, triumphant moment, but it was real. Robert opened his eyes, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. He could feel the cold of the earth beneath him, the weight of his body leaning slightly to one side. The muscles in his legs were alive, burning, but alive. He had done it. I'm standing, he whispered, almost in disbelief. The words felt strange, foreign on his tongue. He looked down at his legs, his hands still gripping the chair for support. His legs were shaking, weak, but they were holding him up. He wasn't falling. Not yet. Lily stepped forward, her smile widening. You did it, she said softly, almost reverently. You're standing. For a long moment, Robert didn't move. He was frozen in place, caught between the past and the present. His mind raced, but his body couldn't seem to catch up. He had spent so long convinced that this moment was impossible, that it couldn't happen, that his mind was struggling to accept what his body had already begun to believe. But then, something deep inside him shifted. A rush of emotion flooded him, joy, relief, gratitude, fearing it was all too much to contain. He let go of the chair, his hands shaking as he reached out for something to steady himself. His legs, still trembling, tried to catch up, but they were no longer just objects to be ignored. They were part of him again, part of the whole person he had almost forgotten. He took one tentative step, then another, and then after what felt like an eternity he was moving, slowly, awkwardly, but he was walking. Tears filled his eyes, blurring his vision, but he didn't care. He took another step, and then another. Each one a small victory. The world around him seemed to fall away as he moved, as if the space had shifted to accommodate him. His body was no longer just a prison. It was a vessel of possibility. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Lily was standing beside him now, watching him walk, her face full of wonder. "You did it," she repeated, her voice full of pride. And in that moment, Robert understood what she had given him. Not just the ability to walk, but the belief that he could, that there was more to life than what he had been living, more to him than the man trapped in a chair. He was whole again. He was alive, and with every step he took, the prison he had built for himself crumbled just a little more. The cold air bit sharply at Robert's face as he took his first steps, but he barely noticed it. His focus was on the movement of his legs, each step tentative but growing stronger with every breath. The world around him felt different now, sharper, clearer, as if the fog that had clouded his vision for so long was finally lifting. The sensation of walking, of moving under his own power, was more than physical. It was a revelation. It was the first true freedom he'd known in 20 years. Lily walked beside him, a few steps behind, her gaze steady, her smile warm but not triumphant. She wasn't here to congratulate him. She had simply believed in him from the very beginning, a belief so pure that it had slowly, quietly, melted away the walls he had built around himself. For so long, Robert had been surrounded by empty praise and false hope. But Lily's belief wasn't something you could dismiss. It was a quiet force, powerful and unwavering, that had penetrated the fortress of his doubt. Robert stopped after a few more steps, his legs still shaky, but his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. His hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, the familiar metal cold under his fingers. But he no longer felt the weight of the chair the way he once had. It was a tool, a lifeline, but it was no longer his anchor. His legs, though weak and unsteady, had begun to tell a different story. "I'm standing," he whispered to himself again, as if the very words had the power to make it real. "I'm walking." The words felt like they belonged to someone else, someone from a time he couldn't quite remember. But here he was, alive again, moving forward, and for the first time into decades. He wasn't just surviving, he was living. Lily stepped up beside him, looking at him with the kind of understanding that only a child could offer. "You've got it now, Mr. Bob," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can walk. You just had to remember how." Robert turned to look at her, a deep ache settling in his chest. His eyes, once hardened by years of frustration and anger, softened as he met her gaze. She wasn't just a little girl who had promised him the impossible. She was the key to unlocking everything he had buried inside himself. She had reminded him of something that had seemed so distant for so long, the power of belief. He took another step, then another, moving with more confidence now. His legs were still unsteady, but they were carrying him, moving in sync with his will. The pain, though still present, had become a distant hum, almost like a memory. The numbness that had dominated his life for so long was fading, replaced by a new kind of sensation, a new kind of awareness. As he walked, the silence around him deepened. It wasn't uncomfortable or suffocating, quite the opposite. It was peaceful, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for him to take the next step. The snow that had fallen earlier that morning had settled, creating a pristine blanket over everything, the branches of the trees above heavy with the weight of it. It was as if the world itself was transformed, standing still, suspended in time, allowing him to become who he was always meant to be. Robert looked up, his gaze sweeping across the grounds of his mansion, then to the woods beyond. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation, now felt like a distant memory, its cold walls no longer able to contain him. He had built it for himself, to escape the world and protect himself from the pain of his injury. But now, the world was his. Again, the mansion, the wealth, the power, it had all meant nothing in the face of his brokenness. But now, with each step, he could see the world differently. He could feel the possibility again, but it wasn't just about the physical act of walking anymore. It was about everything that had led him to this point, the bitterness he had carried, the people who had abandoned him, the friends who had faded away. He had spent so many years pretending that he didn't need anyone, that he could handle it all on his own. But Lily had shown him the truth. It wasn't about the miracle of walking. It was about the miracle of believing in something beyond himself, something bigger than his pain, his bitterness, his isolation. He stopped for a moment, his legs shaking from the effort, but he stood tall. He looked down at Lily, who was watching him closely, her expression quiet but filled with pride. She hadn't said anything, but in her gaze was all the recognition he needed. "You did it," it said. "You found the way. I don't know how to thank you," Robert said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've changed my life." Lily smiled, her eyes bright with something deeper than joy. It was the kind of smile that spoke to a wisdom beyond her years, a quiet understanding of the world's complexities, of what it truly meant to help someone, to believe in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Bob," she said simply. "You already did. You believed." Robert's breath caught in his chest as her words sank in. It wasn't about the miracle of healing. It wasn't about the act of walking. It was about the act of believing in himself, in the possibility of change, in the power of hope. For a long moment, he stood there, the weight of everything that had happened in the last few days sinking in. His mind was still reeling from the emotions, the shock, the overwhelming sense of change. He had spent so many years trapped in his own mind, in his own bitterness. He had refused to let anyone in, afraid that they would see him as weak, as broken. But Lily had come into his life and shown him that there was strength in vulnerability, in trust. There was power in believing that things could be different. And then, just as he was starting to feel the full weight of his transformation, something else shifted in the air. It was subtle, a change in the atmosphere, but Robert felt it, a presence that seemed to wrap around him, filling the space between the trees and the snow-covered ground. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the ground beneath him seemed to shift. He didn't understand it at first, but the feeling was unmistakable. He wasn't alone. He turned slowly, his heart thudding in his chest as he tried to make sense of the sudden change in the air. And then he saw it just beyond the trees, standing in the shadow of the mansion. A figure watching him. The snow made it hard to see clearly, but the outline was unmistakable. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing still as if waiting for something. Robert froze. The sense of dread that crept up on him was suffocating. He wasn't sure who this person was, but something about him felt wrong. Something about the way he was standing there, unmoving, felt like a threat, a reminder of all the years Robert had spent hiding from the world. Lily looked up at the figure, her expression unreadable. "It's okay," she said, her voice soft, but firm. "You've come this far. You're not alone anymore." But Robert wasn't sure. The figure hadn't moved, and the tension in the air felt thick enough to choke him. Who was this person? Why were they watching? "Stay close," Robert muttered to Lily, his body instinctively tensing. There was something about this man that didn't sit right. Something dangerous. The figure didn't speak. He just stood there, his silhouette barely visible in the fading light, waiting for something, waiting for Robert to make a move.